Thank you so much for coming to our annual Gardner Medwin lecture. It was named after our founder, Robert Gardner Medwin, who founded the Display Centre in 1959, and it's very much an annual event. So thank you again for coming. If anybody needs to, the bathrooms at all, they're literally just out the room and to the right. We are going to have the talk for approximately an hour, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers. And then we'd very much like to welcome you back to the exhibition area at the Bluecoat Display Centre, where you can have an informal drink and chat to Walter if you'd like to. So, hopefully, any questions that you might have that you don't want to ask here, you'd be very welcome to ask later. So, thank you very much for coming. I'm Maureen Bampton, Director of the Bluecoat Display Centre, as I think most of you know. And we're very, very honoured to have Walter Keeler here today to do the talk. We've shown his work for many, many years, and it's amazing to have such a wonderful selection as we've got in the exhibition. We've never had anything like that quantity before. So he'll be telling you all about the technicalities and his background. So I think I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much. I'll hand over to Walter. Thank you.
I'll try and speak up. If you can't hear, just yell at me. Counterproductive. Right. Well, I'm starting, as I always do, when I tell the story of my life, right at the beginning. I don't date back quite that far, but those are things I found in the Thames, or foreshore of the Thames, when I was 13, 14, something like that. My dad used to take me to museums a lot. I mean, I came from a very ordinary background, but my dad was keen on old things. He'd been in the services and ended up in Egypt, and went to the Cairo Museum when it reopened at the end of the war, and had a passion for Egyptology and Britain in the Restoration period, particularly London in the Restoration period, Sandal Peaks and all that. So I got taken along to museums, not in the least bit unwillingly, and while my dad pored over documents under green curtains in glass cases, I would wander off and look at what I thought were much more interesting things. Never having been very academic, I respond to objects more than I respond to texts. So anyway, these are some of the things I found. And the connection between those and the museums is quite straightforward, that I would go to museums and I would spot a bit of that. I've got a piece of that pot at home. And the amazing thing is that I had no knowledge of pottery. I didn't know how it was done. I didn't know how it was fired. I knew nothing at all technically about pottery. But having handled all these bits for many years, I mean, it wasn't that many years looking back, but when you were young, a year goes a long way, unlike now. So I had a sort of tactile experience of these things, but I knew what they should feel like. So when I came to actually learn pottery techniques, all that joined together and made a certain sense. That's a mudlark. That's a mid-19th century mudlark. Scavenging along the foreshore of the Thames has an incredibly long history. I think as long as people chuck stuff in, people have pulled it out again and found value in it. And these poor kids would scavenge around bits of rag, wood, bone, metal would be a fantastic find, and they would scrape a living just above the bread line, possibly. And then that's a pair of mudlarks. That's me and my dad at about that time, in the 1950s. You know, I suppose I was about 13, 14, then I don't know, difficult to judge. So that's us, and off we would go mudlarking. And we could find all sorts of things. These are Romano-British bits, that's ring neck flagon tops and handle, and then a reed-rimmed bowl from the Romano British Press. And then I'd go home and get out books on archaeology, and I could look up these things. Number 53, the ring neck flagon, and then there's the mortarium at the bottom of it, a great fat rim. Even before I knew much about it. And these are the rim, the upper part of tankards, probably made of Fulham. So that was this kind of chap. So that's how I gradually got drawn into pottery. To lots of different kinds of slipwork down in the Thames. And that relates to those, and also Maiolica, the tin glazewares, probably Lambeth, that kind of piece. So although I only ever had little bits, I really knew what those little bits belonged to. So, not being academic, and being able to draw a bit, and art, I mean, I suppose that was my other passion in life, was to draw, paint, and do whatever in the visual arts, or at least on paper mostly. And I went to art school. I didn't know what art school was. When I was leaving school, my art teacher said, "What are you going to do now?" And I said, "No idea, I have to get a job." He said, "Well, why don't you go to art school?" And I said, "What's an art school?" And he said, "Well, it's an art school at Harrow, why don't you go there?" And I literally, I can't remember how I went about it really, but I ended up going for an interview with the headmaster of the art school, Mr. Allison. And he said, "Yeah, we'll take you. You can do an intermediate course. And on the first day, they give you a list, crafts to do on Friday. Which one are you going to pick?" And it's pretty obvious which one I picked. And the first thing that Victor Marbury, who ran the course, said was, "You should buy a copy of a Potter's book by Bernard Leach." And there it is. Obediently, I went out and I got my copy. And then, yes, in this book there was some drawings, but very vivid depictions of potters at work like this, and a description of running a pottery, running a studio pottery, making a living at pottery, how you laid it out. You clay at one end and you kiln at the other. And that really appealed to me and captured my imagination. And he had this little drawing of a raku kiln, little updraft kiln, which we had a go at. We didn't have much success, but we certainly had a go, and it was good fun. And I didn't really get engaged too much in his philosophy. I mean, I understood that he learned pottery in the Far East and that he was ingrained in that whole Menge movement, the Japanese sort of respectful tradition, the anonymous craftsman and so forth, which I thought was fair enough. But when I looked at the pots, like this teapot, which is an illustration from the book, I thought, well, I'm not that keen really. Doesn't seem to add up to a very dynamic object. Whereas the Oriental pot, this is a Chinese pot, did have that dynamism. Oh, not all Bernard Leach's pots lack dynamism, but they somehow didn't grasp me. And this sort of pottery, which relates back to my mudlarking, these are things that this one's a pot that I acquired sometime way back, probably 18th century sort of ways. And these pots from Spain, stacked in the kiln, be taken out. Those strong forms with a firmly drawn contour and those very sort of organic looking handles. The process speaking very clearly through the making process. And then there were people like this, Sam Hale, who was he was a painting student at the Royal College of Art in the 1930s, early 40s maybe. Must have been the 30s, I guess. unless it was after the war. I don't know, but it was probably after the war. And he wanted to do abstract painting. He wanted to do surrealist painting. He wanted to be what they called the Picassoette. And that didn't go down at all well in the painting school. So he used to sneak down to the Pottery and make pots and do his painting on those. And his pots had a terrific sort of energy about them. You can see, the things I said about the Spanish pots, that sense of energy and vitality in the process of making is all there in his pots. Those appealed to me. Hans Koper, very different, nonetheless very dynamic, very assured, very sensitively and structurally drawn, so that you could really sort of see the sense in that. But of course Lucy Reed. We used to go to the Design Centre in Hay Hill back in the early 60s and see Lucy Reed's coffee sets for sale, and £50 for a coffee set. It's crazy, isn't it? A cut and saucer now is a fortune. And at that time, £50 was a fortune to us. We were pretty penniless. But nevertheless, it was, you could go and look at them, pick them up, and this is Mick Casson. Mick Casson taught at Harrow. He taught the evening classes when I was first a student. And then he managed to burn his studio down in Buckinghamshire. Somebody gave him a cardboard tub of ash, wood ash, glazes. He put it on a wooden table in his wooden workshop and was woken up in the middle of the night by the flames. So anyway, as a result of that, Victor Margery said to Mick, well, come and teach a day or two on the full-time course to tide you over while you get your workshop rebuilt. So that meant that we, as pottery students, had time with Mick Casson, which was, he taught us drawing, which he always laughed about, but that was really good actually. But Mick was not only a practical help, a teacher of techniques and ways of doing things, he was an inspirational person, and he became a friend for as long as he lived, really. We were always in touch with each other, and lived always within reasonable distance of each other too. This is one of his later pieces. This is a wood ash glazed storage pot, with some of his kind of knitted patterns on them. So these are all things that were influencing me as a student, things that I took notice of and enjoyed. This is a pot by Madeline, my wife. This is one that she made probably back in the 80s. She was a student at the Royal College of Art doing ceramics when it was very industrial, so that she learned industrial techniques and she learned to design patterns to go onto industrial pots. So that she, although she was a studio potter at Harrow, she decided that she wanted to draw in that sort of what studio potters would call industrial to her work. And she was the one who made me look at 18th century Staffordshire pottery. Because up until that point I hadn't thought it worth looking at. Turn to that. Oh, there we are. There's that's one I bought on eBay last year. It's an 18th century Leeds teapot with a related decoration around the shoulder and foot lid, with its twin twisted extruded handles pressed along its spout, thrown and turned on a lathe, as most pots made in that period were. Some mould. Now this is back to my pots. In fact, it's probably the first pot of mine that I've shown you on reflection. This was made in the very late 60s, probably about 1968. I finished at Harrow as a student in 65, and I did a year's teacher training, which was actually quite helpful but crazy. And then I set up my own workshop. I had no idea about production throwing initially. These pieces were thrown with the bottom is upside down, and the bases are stuck together. So it's that ragged bit in the centre is the ragged bit at the bottom of the pot where it met the wheel. And I just decided to dash the top and stick the two bits together. And it's worth just remembering that image so you can recall it later, because that process seems to come back again at some point. That's another little thing, which is just you see, I was doing these strange one-off things, which were to do with what I loved about the clay and working with it, so that, you know, the roughness of the body, the effect of the stamp distorting the pot as well as leaving a very crisp and focused image, and playing around with wooden banners. And that's 16th century tankard from Germany, a Bruegel type tankard. And that's a piece I have in my collection, which I acquired through a friend. I had a dear friend who died a couple of years ago, who was a great restorer of antique pottery, and he had a fabulous collection of pottery, mostly Delftware from the 18th century English Delftware, but also Bellarmines and some Cypriot pots, all sorts of wonderful things. And he used to mend things for me, and we used to trade pots for mending. And then one day he came back and he said, well, I have that teapot from you, and I mended that for you. He said, but I owe you some change. Do you want money or do you want this? So there was no choice. Like that. It's stuck together. There's all little bits and pieces, but who cares? It's a 16th century tankard. And then this is quite an early piece of mine. It's, I started off with an electric kiln, and I was pretty fed up with that, and I've been pulled into the Harrow Studio Pottery course right at its outset, and to do a little teaching. Victor Mulgrew was testing me, I think, to see if it was worth keeping me on. And I because I was a bit of a pyromaniac and had always done silly things with flames and kilns, he suggested I take charge of the kiln site. And having taken charge of the kiln site, taking charge is not quite the right word, I think it's just sort of vaguely kept an eye on it and provoked people to play around rather a lot. I should have a photograph right at the end of it. So anyway, I decided one afternoon, we were talking amongst ourselves, the students and I, and we had this little kiln we were firing. We said, let's put salt in it. So we did. And we realised how straightforward it was really to do salt plates. So the kiln that I'd been building at home, planning to do reduction fired stoneware, became a salt kiln. As soon as I got it firing, I soldered it. And these are some pieces that I made in the very early 70s, 71, 72. And they were kind of, I don't know, what are they? I mean, they're pots, but they're not very useful. And people used to say to me, well, they're very interesting, but what are they for? And I just couldn't tell them. I didn't know what they were for. They didn't know the function. They were just to look at. And that was a turning point, really, because I thought, well, it's a bit pretentious to do that. And I mean, if you can't justify it, people don't like it, then you're up the creek without much of a paddle. So I thought, well, if I make functional things, then at least people can use them, and I don't have to fish around for a use. So this piece, from about that time, reflects my interest in traditional salt glaze pots from the 18th century, 19th century. So I went on to make pots in this vein for a while. And that is probably about, actually that is 75 of our fields, which is aptly enough for the daffodils. So there's no sense in living in Wales, I can grow food with that. We're only just in Wales, because the hill you can see in the distance is actually in Gloucestershire, on the other side of the Wye Valley. So we got to Wales and I built a kiln. And I thought, well, do I really want to do salt glaze anymore? Because it's such a pain in the neck, salt glaze. When the kiln melts, the kiln furniture doesn't last very long. There are lots of risk factors in the production of pots that way. I'll just do reduction. And I just used St Thomas's reduction clay and glazes that were made from wood ash and the local clay. And in case of one on the back, I mean the one at the front is just wood ash and local clay, the one at the back's got some felspar in it. And I was using sun foil to fire the pots. I mean, it's born out of poverty more than anything. We just didn't have a lot of money. So I used to collect sun foil from garages because they said, well, we're just going to take them out on metals, so if you want to take it. So I think I probably helped the environment rather than hindered it by burning the oil. And the great thing about it was that it was full of trace elements of some sort, probably quite a lot of engine parts, sort of fine metal granules or whatever, and it used to toast up nicely. So that was great. And I enjoyed doing that for quite a while. But come the end of the 70s, things were getting very difficult. Those sorts of brown pots were no longer people's heart's desire. I mean, there was a time when, through the 70s when it was sort of strip pine and brown pots, and that was great, and wholemeal bread. But then in the 80s, it turned a corner. There was a recession, so people didn't have a lot of money to spend on surplus items like pots. And high tech became the thing, the more industrial attitudes to domestic objects became fashionable, so that people weren't looking for those humble brown pots. And I was getting pretty desperate, and I had thought quite seriously about quitting, about trying to find a full-time teaching job. Because I'd always done some teaching, because I wanted to put back into that marvellous art school system something to encourage the next lot, because it was dynamic times from that point of view. Art education was terrific, and it was well funded. But all that was being squeezed bit by bit by bit. And by the time I thought about full-time teaching, there weren't any teaching jobs to be had, really. And anyway, I knew it wasn't really for me. I'm not a natural-born teacher, I'm a potter. And I think my contribution to teaching was as a potter. I came in from the outside world making pots, teaching students who had ambition to make pots themselves. So, what did I do? So I thought, well, maybe I should go back to what used to interest me. Throwing bits and pieces, sticking together, getting involved with the process, being a bit more free and experimental. So I made a few vases. I made just a couple of those. And I applied for a Crafts Council bursary, which was given to mature craftspeople who wanted to make a change, either do some research or go in a different direction or in some other way alter that practice. And I put in an application with these sorts of pots, and I didn't get it. And that was in about 1980. It was a biennial thing. in the meantime, I made these funny teapots. And the teapots that I made in the old idiom, the old ash glazed and production thrones and things, I was finding it difficult to sell those for £5 wholesale. Whereas these, I could sell for £15 wholesale. And the Crafts Council brought 2 of them for their collection, which was astonishing to me. So that was a sort of turning point, really. And then in 1982, I applied for bursary again and got it. I was fairly optimistic when I went for the interview because Alison Britton came dashing out of the interview room and said, "It's a bit like that marvellous story from Damon Runyon about the pie eating contest." And one of the contestants turns to his second and says something. The judge says, "Foul, you can't advise your..." I'm not advising him. He said, he just said, "Could you save me a piece of apple pie for after the contest?" With which the opponent gave up. But sorry, that's nothing to do with pottery. Except Alison Britton came rushing out and said, "Save me a piece of that jug for later." And that made me feel a bit better about it. And I did get it. And that launched me into a whole sequence of working which, with hindsight, drew together those 2 threads. I was saying that I was making these one-off things that were, I suppose, on a kind of, I don't know, one day I might say they're sculptural, but then on the other hand I would have cold feet about that. But anyway, they were sort of, let's say, sculptural, and then on the other hand I was making very functional things. And somehow this work brought the 2 together. I was going to say bridge the gap, but it wasn't a bridging the gap, it was the drawing together of the 2 threads, of making pieces that were interesting and possibly even challenging from the visual point of view, from the point of the form and structure, but were also useful. You could actually maintain it and so forth. So this whole series of things developed through the 80s. This is a later one that we made in the possibly even as the 90s. I still make those from time to time. This is an early 80s one. I've still got that pot, and I really like that pot, but I can't make it anymore. It's a pot that came about through a need, really. I decided that I wanted to make something soft and round and sort of harsh and angular. And I just did a little drawing, a doodly drawing of this pot. And I made a few of them straight away. But then I made others subsequently, and they never ever had the quality that this one's got. And another thing that happened much later, a student came up to me at Bristol and said, "I know we got that teapot." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I know where you got that idea." And she showed me a picture of a Chinese pot, which was a spherical shape with a gorge shape on the top of it. It was in white porcelain and enamel. And it was a dead ringer for that. And I honestly haven't seen it, and it's just astonishing how ideas somehow must be in the air. But so anyway, that's the story of that pot. And as I say, it's a pot that I can't make again. And when I talk about my work in retrospect like this, you realise that you're actually not that person anymore. I mean, physically, I've got the strength and the kind of dynamics that I had when I did that. But you've also moved on in a piece that I made in the 90s. That's called a Kate 80 dish, because Kate 80 did what was the programme called? Something like the Great Picture Show. Celebrities were given some money and told to go out and buy art. And Kate 80 decided, because she was from Sunderland, that she would buy pottery. And she ended up buying one of my dishes from the Vintage shop, which was a dish very ironic. That's another platform dish. telescopically handles. I mean, you could actually use it that way. And this is a glass funerary urn that was photographed in the Nîmes Museum, but that sort of glassware was, I'm not sure where it was made, but it was available all over the Roman Empire. A lot of it was brought to Britain, or then it was made in Britain, I doubt it. And that's a handle from a piece of German salt glaze, 18th century German salt glaze. And that handle really still gives me a thrill. The potter's obviously pulled his thumb, it would have been a knee as well in those days, pulled his thumb down the centre of the handle, and then making a groove, and then either side of it pinch that groove together to a very narrow, tight, sort of springy looking little channel. And then the surface at the bottom is whipped up into a little curl. And that inspired me to do these, what the Catherine used to call whoopee handles. And I still make those because so much demand for them. And that's another dish. Handles this time were extrusions which had been a little bit cut out of them, a strip cut out through half the thickness and then bent round to form a catenary arch, and then mitered into the throne room of the pot. Those are the dishes on plinths. I still like those. I still feel there's something there that I could use. Now these similar forms to the last one, but on little tripods, again made from extrusions, cutting a piece out of the extrusion and bending it round and forming that catenary, and then a mitered change of angle, and then stuck to the bottom of the pot. That was that ionic style of handle, thrown discs stuck back to back. When private views were an incredibly dynamic event. I turned up for the opening, and there was a queue down the street. And as the doors opened, people rushed into the desk, and Bill Ismay, who you met, a little blackberry, was first to the desk, and he said, "I want number 58. And they said, "No, sold. It can't be, I was in front of the queue and I was first to the desk." He said, "But somebody bought it this afternoon. We didn't put the spot on until the doors opened." So that was the tenor of it. And I sold probably 2/3 at the opening. And by the end of the show, they wanted more stock. That's how it was then. It was just absolutely astonishing. Hung like that for a good few years. Perhaps it's a good thing. So, I haven't talked much about the technicalities of these pots. Actually, that previous slide's a good one to mention a couple of things. With the salt glaze, the salt texture varies from one pot to another. And that's controlled by dipping the pot partially or completely, then cutting away, into an engo or a biscuit slip, which is 60 feldspar 40 china clay. And the body has sand in it, an 18-inch sand, about 10% or so. And those little concentrations of silica in the sand encourage the glaze to form in that orange-green texture on the surface. Where I put the engo over the top, it masks that, so that it's only where little pinholes fall through that coating that you get the little scars in the film. And the colour is simply sprayed on. The clay is fairly drab on its own. I dip and delineate or distinguish between the areas of texture that I want, and then spray the whole thing with colour. And that's a mixture of chrome and cobalt on that piece. And it had the characteristic, occasionally, for no reason that I could ever fathom, to go matte in that way, to develop a bloom effect, like a plum. You know, before you actually touch it with the fingerprints on it. That's that same quality. But it was something I couldn't predict and couldn't ask for. And that treated me exactly the same way. It was quite training. And all sorts of wacky teapots have emerged. God knows where they came from. This was a drawing I did